Welcome back to Purely IFS, a show that aims to support therapists and practitioners in using internal family systems as their primary approach with clients. I'm Gail Williamson.
And I'm Emma Redfern. In today's episode, we're focusing on the process of asking parts to give space, which is often framed as asking them to step back.
Yes, to ask parts to step back or not, that is today's question. When you're learning the model, this can be one of those things that causes a lot of uncertainty. When do I ask a part to step back? Was I right to ask that part to step back? Or should I have made it the target part instead?
So we're going to talk about the different aspects of this, give some language options around it, and of course some case examples.
I imagine some listeners may appreciate basic guidelines as to what to do when they detect a secondary part during the protocol and need to ask a part to step back. For example, when I ask the 4th F question, as in asking the client how they feel towards the part we're trying to get to know, and I detect another part in the response, do I name the part for the client and then straight away get them to ask the part to step back, or...
Sure. And again, this is one of those things where people may have seen or been in demos where the therapist just asks a part to step back and it does. And so the new IFS therapist might tend to go straight to using ask the part to step back with a client, only to find that a lot of the time the part doesn't want to, or it says it will, but doesn't really. And actually, if we really take seriously the approach of all parts are welcome, then maybe we're not always going to be in such a hurry to ask secondary parts, by which we mean the non-target part, or a part reacting to the target part, to step back.
Yeah, when I pick up a secondary part, my tendency is to give the part some space, because this makes it more likely that the part really will sit back for a while. So if a secondary part has, in response to the 4th F, said that it's annoyed with the target part, I'll get the client to ask the part if it would like to say why. And maybe the target part is a workaholic manager. And so the secondary part says, well, it just never stops. It's exhausting. And so I can get the client to communicate understanding and then to add, but if you're willing to step back right now and let me talk to the workaholic, I might be able to help it to not work quite so hard, which is of course a bit of hope merchanting, always useful. And then the annoyed part is okay to step back.
Yes, great. Whereas if you just immediately got the client to ask the annoyed part to step back without giving it space to speak a little, it would probably have kept coming in wanting to be heard.
That's right. And if I approach it like this, I can avoid having to perhaps switch fully from the target part to the annoyed part. But it is a judgment call in the moment, isn't it, Emma? About whether you can ask a part to step back, or whether it needs a bit of space, or whether you need to switch focus completely to the secondary part.
Sure. With experience of the relationship, we get a sense of a client's system and how to respond to their various parts.
But again, as a general guide, I would say that even when maybe I'm sensing I can just go straight to step back, I'm going to do it in a sensitive, relational way. So the client's pleaser part is a target part, and it's saying it thinks it's really important the client keeps quiet and avoids confrontation. And when you do a check for self-energy with the 4th F,
as of course we do frequently when helping a client get to know a part from self, as we don't want to just assume the client is easily accessing self and able to maintain this without our assistance.
Yeah, when you ask how do you feel towards this pleaser part when you hear it say that, and the response is, well, I think it's wrong. I should be able to stand up for myself. Again, depending on what I'm sensing, I can tell the client, let the part that wants you to stand up for yourself know that you hear it and that it's going to get a chance to say more about that. But for now, would it be willing to sit back and let you stay with the pleaser? It's welcome to listen. It might actually help it understand the pleaser more.
And then the part is likely to be okay with sitting back, but of course it might not be, in which case it will make it clear that it needs attention now, and so you then switch target part, or focus part as some people prefer to call it.
Important too, in terms of our practice, to not assume that a part that we've asked to step back has stepped back. We need to get confirmation. And if the client doesn't volunteer that the part has indeed stepped back, we need to check. So did the part step back, Mary?
And then, of course, when we get confirmation, we ask the "how do you feel towards" question again. We're not going to assume the client is now in self. There may be another part we need to negotiate with for space. And it's here also where we will be able to detect that the part that just agreed to sit back has changed its mind.
So maybe just to say more about how do you know whether to ask a part to step back or whether to switch focus to it, and how actually there is a middle option here.
Yes, it's not necessarily a binary X or Y here, i.e. the part steps back, or we switch focus and go back to the start of the 6Fs with a new part. A possible middle way is for the client and therapist just to spend a few moments with the secondary part to address its concerns or do a quick update. This is likely to be sufficient, especially if there's already a relationship with the part stepping in.
So, an example of what that might look like. Say the client is getting to know a big control part. They've gotten to a point of updating the part and explaining how self can help, and it's clear the control part is softening and is even feeling some relief that there's someone else who can help. And you check, how are you feeling, Mary, towards the control part as you sense that? And the response is, I think there's another part. I'm just aware of a lot of fear. Oh, great, you noticed. Maybe we should focus on that for a bit. Can you tell that part that you can feel that it's scared? And could it tell you why? And Mary says, it's saying, who will look after me now? Ah, can it say more? It's like it looks at the control part as its parent or something, and it's scared now that it's not going to be there. I understand. Can you let the part know, however, that we're not getting rid of the control part? That's not what this is about. We're just finding out more about it and how we can help. That control part will always be there. We can't get rid of any part. Ah, okay, the scared part has faded back now. Great, so turn back to the control part. How are you feeling towards her now?
So in terms of the process you've just described, Gail, when you got the client to turn to the scared part, you didn't need to strictly adhere to the protocol and, for example, get them to find the part, flesh it out, and ask how they felt towards it.
No.
Instead, you chose to ask about the part's fears, address them, and then the client reported the fearful part faded back. Then you were able to return to the target part, and of course, the first thing you did was check, how are you feeling towards the control part now, Mary, before you continued? And I love that you gave this example of spending time with a fearful part, as to me that's one of the great things about IFS. We turn towards the fear in the system.
Yes, and the anger. I find there are some parts that I typically wouldn't ask to sit back when they come in, and anger is definitely one.
Yes, some parts that you know are likely more extreme or dominant, or that perhaps don't usually get a lot of space in someone's system, and that you'd expect to be spending a bit more time with.
So with a part that's very angry, and I'm not referring to the kind of part that comes in and says it doesn't like the target part. I mean the part that the client is perhaps describing to you as being in a rage, or maybe the part is in their stomach and it feels like a cauldron. I always want to catch angry parts like this when they come up and give them a lot of space. And say if there was a secondary part flooding someone with tiredness, I would turn to this part too, because these parts typically have a very strong effect on the body and really blend with the client. And the most efficient thing for the therapist to do is to talk to it and learn why it has come in and what it's concerned about.
Sure.
Probably the one situation where I might be quick to ask secondary parts to step back is when time is short.
As in when you're near the end of a session?
Yeah, it may be a session where the client and I have spent the majority of the time exploring an issue, but then with maybe 10 or 15 minutes left, I suggest checking in with the part or parts we're currently working with.
It's always worth trying to facilitate continuity.
And so say it was an exile you wanted them to check in on, they connect with the little boy, and when you check for self-energy, you hear a part saying, he just looks really weak and pathetic.
So then you're naming a critical part for the client and saying, just let that part know you hear it, but can it just step back and let you be with the boy, just for a couple of minutes?
Or say we were at a critical point with the firefighter urging suicide, and again perhaps time was short. I would be quite firm with any secondary parts, but I would want to be sure that I was accessing self-energy before doing this. So maybe a manager who we had already heard from was coming in again and saying, this part has to be stopped. And being generally critical, I would identify the manager for the client, and then with a firmness in my voice, I would guide them to ask for it to sit back. So something like, that's your critical manager again, I think. Tell him you hear him, but tell him he needs to step back and let you handle this firefighter.
Yes, or equally, a lot of the time with parts threatening the ultimate solution, the therapist may likely be the one talking to the firefighter directly.
Sure. And so if I was doing explicit direct access and detected the manager coming in, I would probably check first with the client, am I still talking to the firefighter? It sounds like your critical manager may have come in. And my client will be able to confirm if this is the case or not. And then I approach it something like, so I'm going to let this manager know that I hear him, but he needs to step back and let me stay with this firefighter. That's what will help. Again, I'm doing a bit of hope merchanting, which is always my preference. Actually, in terms of being quite quick to ask a part to step back, I'm also thinking I will do that with the caregiver protector.
Ah, yes. Is that the one that tends to want to give an exile a hug?
Yes, always, where the client has access to an exile in a sad situation, and you're working to assess and facilitate the connection. So at some point you're asking, how do you feel towards this little girl when you see her sitting there crying? And they reply, I just want to give her a hug. So then I'm fairly quick to say, I wonder, do you see the part that wants to hug her? Just thank them for trying to help right now, but ask the part to step back and let you be with this girl.
I'm sure that's familiar to a lot of us. I guess I'm conscious of not wanting to shame any caring parts. And I'm also aware that the inner world is one where consent is key. We don't want to impose anything on parts before they're ready. So another way I might handle a caring part rushing in to give an exile a hug is to say something like, let's just see if the little one is open to that. There's no rush. She may need time to trust. I'd want in some way to slow things down and remind us all that this is a new relationship. The step back process is also an opportunity to practice and develop your parts detecting.
Yes, I'm thinking of times when we might have asked a part to step back. We then ask the fourth F again to check for self-energy, but we don't hear it. We detect a part again, but we name it as another part instead of detecting that it's the same part that had just agreed to step back.
And if you can catch it as the same part, it means you're going to have more clarity, which is always worth having. Instead of perhaps feeling that there are lots of different parts coming in and then potentially feeling overwhelmed or confused.
So, for example, you're asking your client, how do you feel towards this critical part? Well, I think it must be trying to help, but I can't figure out how. Seems like there's a part trying to figure the critical one out. Would it be prepared to sit back and let you hear from the critic directly? You might get some useful information if it does. Yeah, it's fine with that. Great. So how do you feel now towards the critical part? Well, I'd just like to find out what will help it not be so strong. I'd like to understand it better.
Which of course sounds like more figuring out.
Yes, so I parts detect for the client and say, I'm wondering, is that perhaps still the figuring out part? And they're able to confirm that yes, it is.
Because of course this is about us relating parts as well as clients. So I like to think of it as building up a picture or a sense of a client's part as a particular personality rather than simply following a process or step. So we listen out for identifying characteristics to help us differentiate one part from another.
Of course, for new IFS therapists, we may name it as another part instead of the same secondary part. That's not going to be a huge problem. We're just saying that it's useful in terms of maintaining clarity if you can become more skilled in detecting and recognizing individual parts. And then, of course, I'm thinking about the language options we have in the step back process. As we know, by necessity, there's a lot of repetition in our use of IFS protocol.
And of course, we don't really want to change the wording of, for example, the fourth F question, how do you feel towards this part? But we can be a bit more creative in how we ask a part to step back, and at the same time ease any anxiety parts of us may have about a client getting fed up hearing the same request.
Again, the more experience you gain, the more you will expand your IFS vocabulary. In the beginning, I used to keep a notebook where I could note down examples of a different language I came across in books or heard on demos. But I think the less your figuring out part takes charge in trying to learn the IFS model, the more you get access to self's flexibility and creativity and how you can talk to the parts.
So focusing on alternatives to step back, we can ask a part to relax or soften back or sit back, ease back or give space instead. Or we might say, ask the part if it would be willing to move behind you and just let you talk to the sceptical part directly. Dick Schwartz often suggests the client ask a part to go to a waiting room.
For some reason, I use that option the least, but it is actually really useful, particularly if there's a part that's scared of the target part, and then I would be saying, let that part know it doesn't have to be here. It can actually go and wait in a comfortable room if it likes, and let you handle this angry part. And also, when you talk about asking a part to give space, I realise that's one I also don't use because it doesn't quite sound natural to me, or maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a bit American. Make space or make some room would make more sense to me language-wise. Or suggesting the client ask a part to give them more space instead of just give space.
So again, I guess it just highlights how important it is to pay attention to the language we use in this model, but probably also that we use language we feel comfortable with, and equally importantly, that our clients' systems can tolerate. I really don't want to be using language that is off-putting or provides yet another constraint inside someone's system. Something else that might be worth including here is that sometimes when time is short, I don't bother with precise parts detecting, and I do a sort of broadcast step back in response to an unclear answer to the fourth F. Okay, great, you feel X towards the part. Just see if there's anyone inside trying to help you out there too. If there are parts trying to help, just see if they'll give you some space. Let them know you can handle it.
Or in a similar vein, I'm thinking of a client of mine who has three main protectors around ensuring that he doesn't make a mistake. One part that causes a strong feeling of frustration, a part that makes him very tired, and a third one that doubts everything. We know these parts well, and it often happens that when we're with another part, and it may often be an exile who's talking of difficult situations in the past, these three will frequently show up, one after the other, in which case I'm doing a broadcast to all three to get them to step back.
And just a reminder to listeners, we cover broadcast direct access in episode 2 of the podcast. Really useful to know about that.
Yeah, so when this client's three protectors show up, I'll name them for him and I'll broadcast a message, something like, it's your doubting part and the frustrated and tired ones, isn't it? And we know that they're only doing what they always do, working so hard to protect you and ensure that you don't get anything wrong. I'm just going to let them know that we're not going to do much more today, just a few minutes more. So can they step back and just let you make sure that this little boy is comfortable and that he knows that you're going to return next week?
Great.
I'd also like to highlight the distinction between step back and pull back. I notice that clients and therapists alike can get a bit confused by this. Clients naturally take note that when you're helping them talk to their parts, you're often asking parts to step back. And so when a client is perhaps asking me how they should interact with parts during the week, I often get the question, so Gail, if that sad part comes up, should I just ask it to step back?
A lovely opportunity to offer some IFS psychoeducation to a client about how relating to parts in a therapy session can look and be different to how they might relate to parts in their own daily life. Where parts who might appear spontaneously in between therapy sessions with emotions such as sadness or loneliness are likely to be exiles, and we want to reach out to welcome them, not have them step back. Interestingly, Gail, I've included how to relate to parts in daily life in my next book, due out at the end of the year, hopefully.
I'm sure that will be very useful. But of course, new IFS therapists also need to learn certain differences, the nuances of how we might speak to a protector versus an exile. So when we've agreed with a client to get to know a particular part in a therapy session, then we might ask other parts getting in the way of that meeting, likely protectors, to step back. But then, if exile feelings come up and begin flooding the client, we will use explicit direct access and ask the exile to pull back some of their feelings from the client to make it easier for self to be with the exile.
So we preference step back with protectors and the softer pull back wording with exiles. Subtle but important differences in language, understanding and usage of the requests.
But say the target part was a dominant protector and you were trying to facilitate a self-to-part connection, and maybe it becomes clear to you that the client is very blended with the protector. For example, a firefighter making them feel so tired. Here we would also use the pullback wording, because we don't actually want the protector to go away. We're trying, after all, to get self into connection with the protector. We just don't want that firefighter to be so strong.
Yes, and we have options around the language here too. Instead of pull back, I might say something like, ask the part to dial back the intensity just a little so that it doesn't overwhelm you. Let the part know that if it overwhelms you, then it will continue to be on its own. But if it's willing to reduce its intensity, you'll be able to be there and help. So there's a lot to the step back process.
It's IFS, and nothing is black and white or one-dimensional. I think it can feel a lot, though, for our figuring out managers to get to grips with.
Sure.
But of course, we're developing our skills and vocabulary and our own style all the time, and these are just options that we're offering here.
Yes. So thanks again for joining us on Purely IFS. We'll be back again soonish. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone.